There are moments in history when a single flame changes everything. Not the kind of fire that burns down cities or lights up battlefields, but something quieter, more dangerous. A fire that shouldn't have been lit at all. August 28, 1865, on a windswept hilltop in what we now call Wyoming, a young Lakota scout named Eagle Feather faced an impossible choice. In front of him lay kindling and flint. Behind him, moving through the darkness, came 2,000 soldiers with orders to kill everyone they found. And the law of his people, the sacred law handed down for generations, absolutely forbade the fire he was about to light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. To understand why Eagle Feather stood on that hill, trembling with more than just the late summer cold, we need to go back 9 months. Back to a morning that burned itself into Lakota memory like a brand. November 29th, 1864. Sand Creek, in what's now Colorado. A peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment flying an American flag and a white flag of truce. 700 cavalry soldiers under Colonel John Chivington attacked at dawn. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was butchery. 200 people murdered, most of them women, children, and elderly. Chivington's men took scalps, body parts, as trophies. They mutilated the dead in ways I won't describe in detail here, but which were so horrific that even officers in the United States Army called for Chivington's prosecution. The news of Sand Creek spread through the plains like a prairie fire. Eagle Feather, 17 years old that winter, sat in his grandfather's lodge and listened to survivors tell their stories. His grandfather, a man named Broken Arrow who had lived through 6 decades of peace and war, wept openly. Eagle Feather had never seen his grandfather cry. That night, as snow fell outside and the fire burned low, the old man made his grandson promise something. "We will never sleep defenseless again," Broken Arrow said. Never. The Lakota weren't naive about warfare. They'd fought the Crow, the Pawnee, sometimes each other. But this was different. This was soldiers attacking under flags of peace, killing indiscriminately, celebrating the murder of children. The psychological impact can't be overstated. Imagine living in a world where suddenly the old rules, the old certainties about honor and warfare, meant nothing. Where flying a white flag might get you killed faster than fighting back. So through that bitter winter of 1864 into the spring of 1865, the Lakota developed something remarkable. Not just a warning system, but a sophisticated network of signal fires that could span hundreds of miles of territory. They positioned firekeepers on hilltops and ridges, each within sight of the next. The system required precision. Too close together, you wasted personnel. Too far apart, the chain broke. They settled on positions roughly 8 to 10 miles apart, chosen for visibility and defensive capability. Each keeper had prepared fire pits with specific fuel, dried sage for quick lighting, then seasoned cottonwood that burned hot and bright but produced relatively little smoke during the day, more visible flame at night. Eagle Feather trained as a firekeeper that spring. It wasn't just about watching and lighting fires. The keepers had to know the land, understand weather patterns that might obscure signals, recognize the difference between military movements and hunting parties. They developed a language of flames. Sustained fire meant immediate danger. Pulsing fires indicated direction of threat. Multiple fires meant multiple threats. It was elegant and simple and potentially life-saving. But here's where it gets complicated. The Lakota spiritual calendar had its own rhythms, its own requirements. Late August marked the ceremony of the White Buffalo Calf Woman, one of the most sacred observances in Lakota religion. During this time, from sunset until dawn, fires, except those in lodges, were forbidden. The night sky had to remain dark for the ceremony's proper completion. To light an outdoor fire during this time wasn't just breaking a rule, it was violating sacred law, potentially bringing misfortune to the entire people. Eagle Feather knew this. Every firekeeper knew this. They'd built this elaborate system, this network that could save lives, and for 1 week each August, it went silent. Meanwhile, in Fort Laramie, General Patrick Connor was assembling something massive. 2,500 soldiers, 3 separate columns, Pawnee scouts who knew the terrain and hated the Lakota with a passion born from generations of conflict. Connor's orders, documented in military records, were chillingly explicit. You will not receive overtures of peace or submission from Indians, but will attack and kill every male Indian over 12 years of age. Read that again. Every male over 12. These weren't battlefield orders. This was planned extermination. Connor had studied what happened at Sand Creek, and rather than being horrified, he'd apparently decided it was a template. His strategy was sophisticated. 3 columns advancing from different directions to trap Lakota bands between them. He waited for late August deliberately. His scouts told him about the White Buffalo Calf Woman ceremony, about the dark nights when signal fires would be forbidden. He planned his main assault for August 29th, but he began his march on the night of the 28th, moving under a bright moon towards 7 Lakota villages clustered along the Tongue River. 800 people. Men, women, children, elders, all sleeping, all unaware. Connor had learned the wrong lesson from Sand Creek. He'd learned that surprise and overwhelming force against sleeping villages produced results. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that a young firekeeper named Eagle Feather was about to make a choice that would haunt him and save him in equal measure. Because Eagle Feather saw them coming. 2,000 men and horses, moving through the moonlight like a dark river, and he stood on his hilltop with his hand on the kindling, knowing that if he lit this fire, he might save 800 lives, and knowing with equal certainty that he'd be violating everything he'd been taught about the sacred. What do you do when the law meant to protect your soul might cost your people their lives? Eagle Feather's hands shook, and it wasn't from the cold. The August night carried that peculiar high plains chill that comes after sunset, even in summer. But the trembling came from somewhere deeper. Below him, spread out across maybe 2 miles of terrain, Connor's force moved with surprising discipline. The general had learned something about plains warfare. No bugles, no shouted orders. Just the soft thunder of 2,000 horses' hooves on summer-hard ground, the creak of leather, the occasional metallic clink quickly silenced. The moon was 3 days past full, bright enough to cast shadows, bright enough for Eagle Feather to see his own hands as he knelt beside the fire pit he'd prepared months ago, bright enough to see the neat stack of sage and cottonwood, bright enough to make him visible to anyone who might be watching from the villages below. He thought about his grandfather. Broken Arrow had died 2 months earlier, peacefully in his sleep, which was a gift the old man had earned through a long life. But before he died, he'd made Eagle Feather promise to honor the sacred laws. The ceremonies keep us, Lakota, the old man had said. Without them, we're just people on horses. The ceremonies are what make us a people. Eagle Feather had promised. Of course he'd promised. You don't refuse a dying, grandfather's request. But Broken Arrow had also made him promise, that night after hearing about Sand Creek, that the people would never sleep defenseless again. 2 promises, both sacred, both impossible to keep simultaneously. He could see the villages from his position, 7 camps strung along the Tongue River where it bent through a cottonwood grove. In the moonlight, the teepees looked like pale cones, maybe 120 lodges total, 800 people, give or take. He knew many of them. 3 horses, who'd taught him to track elk. Meadowlark woman, who made the best pemmican and always gave him extra when he visited her camp, little children he'd played with, elders he'd listened to, warriors he'd hunted beside, all sleeping, all trusting that the sacred prohibition on fires meant they were safe during ceremony time, that no enemy would dare attack when the spirits were so close, when the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was so thin. Connor was counting on exactly that trust. Eagle Feather closed his eyes and spoke to the spirits. Not a formal prayer, because there wasn't time for formality, but the kind of desperate conversation you have when you're completely out of options. Grandfathers, he whispered in Lakota, using the term for all the ancestors, all the spirits who watch over the people. I'm about to break sacred law. I'm asking you to understand. I'm asking you to forgive me. But if I don't light this fire, by dawn there will be 800 new spirits joining you, and most of them will be children and grandmothers who died in their sleep. He opened his eyes. The column was closer now. Maybe an hour from the first village. Maybe less. I'm asking you to show me if this is wrong, he said. Send me a sign. Anything. If you don't want me to light this fire, show me now. He waited. The wind didn't change. No owl called. No sudden cloud covered the moon. The universe remained silent. Or perhaps it was speaking and he couldn't hear it over the hammer of his own heartbeat. Eagle Feather struck flint against steel. The spark caught in the sage caught the cottonwood, and just like that, a flame that absolutely should not exist climbed into the August night. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The fire built, bright and clear, and utterly illegal in every spiritual sense. Then, to the north, maybe 8 miles distant, another fire bloomed. The next keeper in the chain had seen Eagle Feather's signal and made his own impossible choice. Then another fire, further west. Then another. Then 3 more, spreading across the darkness like stars falling to earth in reverse. Each keeper seeing the signal, understanding what it meant, knowing the cost, and lighting their own forbidden flame anyway. It was beautiful and terrible. The fire chain racing across 40 miles of hills and valleys, each flame a small rebellion against sacred law, each flame a prayer for forgiveness, each flame potentially the difference between life and death for people who would never know the names of those who saved them. But fires alone wouldn't be enough. The chain included riders, young men on fast horses stationed at key points, ready to cover the distances the fires couldn't reach, to ride to the camps too far from the hilltops, to spread the warning where flames couldn't speak. Swift Hawk was the first rider to reach the villages. He was 19, rode a painted horse that could run forever, and he nearly killed that horse getting down from the hills. He hit the first camp screaming, "Soldiers, soldiers coming, move now, move now," in a voice that cracked with urgency. The reaction was remarkable. No panic, no chaos. This is what you need to understand about these people. They drilled for this. After Sand Creek, after the promise of never defenseless again, they'd practiced. Every camp had an evacuation plan. Every family knew their role. Mothers woke children with gentle urgency, teaching them in that moment the difference between fear and panic. "We're going on an adventure," one mother told her 5-year-old daughter, bundling her in a robe. "We're going to see the hidden canyon." The child, sleepy and confused, nodded. She didn't need to understand. She just needed to move. The elders caused the only arguments. Several refused to leave without their medicine bundles, their sacred objects. "I didn't survive 60 winters to run away and forget who I am," one old man said, stubbornly tying his bundle despite his daughter's pleas to hurry. But here's the thing. Nobody left him behind. If grandfather wanted his medicine bundle, someone carried grandfather, and someone else carried the bundle. The practical goods, the cooking pots, the extra robes, the stored food, all that stayed behind. But the medicine bundles, the things that made them Lakota, those went with them. The warriors had a different job. As families moved north and west into the Badlands, where Connor's cavalry couldn't easily follow, the warriors created false trails. They dragged brush to confuse the tracks. They built small fires in canyons leading the wrong direction. They left a few old teepees standing in some camps while completely clearing others, trying to make it look like random abandonment rather than organized evacuation. They were buying time, creating confusion, turning Connor's certainty into doubt. The evacuation took 3 hours. 3 hours of organized, controlled movement of 800 people, most on foot because they couldn't risk the noise of that many horses. 3 hours while eagle feathers forbidden signal fires burned themselves out on distant hilltops, having served their impossible purpose. Connor reached the first village at dawn. The timing was perfect for an attack, perfect for catching people sleeping, drowsy, confused. His troops deployed in textbook fashion, surrounding the camp, closing off escape routes that didn't matter because nobody was there to escape. The general sat on his horse in the growing light and stared at empty lodges. Cook fires cold. No bodies, no people, no victory, no massacre, just abandoned camps and the morning wind moving through vacant teepees. His rage was spectacular. According to accounts from his own officers, Connor screamed at his Pawnee scouts, accusing them of warning the Lakota, of betrayal, of incompetence. The scouts, insulted and angry, pointed out the obvious: the signal fires. You could still see the burned spots on the hilltops if you knew what to look for. You could read the whole system if you understood what you were seeing. Connor understood then. He'd been outsmarted not by military tactics, but by a network of firekeepers who'd valued life over law, who'd chosen salvation over ceremony. The quote attributed to him, whether exact or not, captured his frustration perfectly. They vanished like smoke. He wasn't wrong. 800 people had literally disappeared into the August morning. But they hadn't vanished like smoke. They'd been saved by smoke, by forbidden flames lit by young men who chose damnation over complicity in another sand creek. Eagle Feather watched the sunrise from his hilltop, the fire pit at his feet now cold and grey. He'd broken sacred law, he knew that. He accepted it. And as the sun climbed over the eastern plains, painting the world in gold and red, he wondered if he'd just saved his people or damned his soul. Connor wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. He'd spent $2 million in government money on this campaign, $2 million in 1865 money, which is roughly equivalent to about $40 million today. He'd marched 2,500 soldiers across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. He'd planned this operation for months, and he'd found empty camps and cold fire pits. So he pursued. Of course he pursued. The problem was, the Lakota had 800 years of accumulated knowledge about these badlands. Every canyon, every hidden spring, every box canyon that looked like a trap, but actually had a back exit known only to people who'd hunted here for generations. Connor had maps drawn by cartographers who'd never set foot in this country. The Lakota had memory. The refugees moved in organized groups of 50 to 100 people, each group taking different routes to different predetermined refuges. This wasn't improvised. This was doctrine developed over the winter, refined through spring, drilled until even the children knew which canyon their family was supposed to reach. The largest group headed for a place the Lakota called Hidden Valley, a box canyon with a narrow entrance and a spring-fed creek. From the outside, it looked like a dead end. From the inside, if you knew where to look, a steep trail led up and over the back wall. What strikes me about the refugee camps is the level of social organization they maintained under extraordinary stress. These weren't 800 individuals scrambling for survival. This was a functioning community that had temporarily relocated. Women formed childcare circles, sharing the responsibility of watching the young ones so others could gather food or maintain watch. The children, remarkably, understood they were playing a game where silence was part of the rules. They hunted small game with traps, they gathered plants, they played quiet games in the shadows, while cavalry patrols rode past a mile away. The hunters brought in deer and elk, and here's a detail that tells you everything about Lakota values. The meat was distributed equally, not based on who killed the animal, not based on which village you came from originally. Equal shares, because in crisis, you're all one people. A grandmother from one band got the same portion as a warrior from another. Try to imagine that happening in our world. Try to imagine 800 stressed, scared, hungry people sharing equally without someone hoarding or someone claiming they deserve more. Connor's cavalry spent 2 weeks searching those badlands. 2 weeks of frustration and increasing casualties. Because while the Lakota refugees were hiding, Lakota warriors were hunting. Small groups, never more than 10 men, hitting supply wagons, ambushing scouts, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Not enough to stop Connor's force, but enough to make every mile cost something. The most famous of these delaying actions happened at Wolf Creek Canyon on September 3rd. 12 elderly warriors, men in their 50s and 60s who'd been deemed too old to keep up with the younger fighters, volunteered to hold a narrow pass while a group of families moved through more difficult terrain. Their leader was a man named Stands Alone, 62 years old, who'd fought the Crow in his youth and the cavalry in his middle age, and apparently decided his old age should involve one more fight. The tactical situation was actually brilliant in its simplicity. Wolf Creek ran through a canyon with walls maybe 30 feet high, with the creek itself taking up most of the canyon floor. To get through, you either walked in the creek or walked on a narrow shelf on one side. 12 men with rifles, positioned on the canyon walls with prepared firing positions and covered retreats between positions, could make that passage very expensive. An entire cavalry company, roughly 120 men, tried to force the canyon. The first attempt was straightforward. Ride through fast, accept some casualties, overwhelm the defenders with numbers. It failed because horses don't like being shot at in confined spaces, and cavalry that can't move isn't cavalry anymore. It's just frightened men on panicking animals in a shooting gallery. The second attempt was dismounted infantry tactics. Send men forward on foot, use covering fire, advance in rushes. Better tactics, but the 12 warriors had the advantage of height and prepared positions. Every time the soldiers advanced, they took casualties. Every time they pulled back to regroup, the warriors shifted to new positions. The company commander, a captain whose name survives in military records as James Morrison, finally tried to flank the position by sending men up and over the canyon walls. This actually worked, sort of. They got men above the warriors' positions. But by that point, Stands Alone and his 11 companions had accomplished their mission. 6 hours. They'd held that canyon for 6 hours, which was 5 hours longer than anyone expected. The families they were protecting had reached safety. When Morrison's flanking force finally reached the top of the canyon walls, they found prepared positions, spent shell casings, blood on the rocks, and no warriors. The 12 had withdrawn, following planned retreat routes that took them through terrain no cavalry could follow. Morrison later reported in his official dispatch that he'd faced at least 50 well-armed warriors in fortified positions. He'd actually faced 12 old men with single-shot rifles and an intimate knowledge of their own land. Of the 12, 3 died in that fight. Stands Alone was one of them. He was found by his people 3 days later, having made it 5 miles from the canyon before bleeding out from a chest wound. His rifle was empty, his knife was bloody, and next to him were strips of cloth he'd cut from his shirt to mark the trail for anyone following, right up until he couldn't cut anymore. Back in the refugee camps, Eagle Feather was dealing with his own crisis, not bullets and cavalry, but something potentially more dangerous to a young man raised in a deeply spiritual culture. Guilt. He'd broken sacred law. He knew he'd saved lives, but he'd also violated everything he'd been taught about the ceremonies, about the proper relationship between the human and spiritual worlds. He wasn't eating much, wasn't sleeping well, kept to himself. Other young warriors tried to talk to him, tried to tell him he'd done the right thing, but Eagle Feather couldn't hear it. In his mind, he'd committed a spiritual crime, and the fact that it had good results didn't erase the crime. The spiritual leaders watched this for 3 days. Then they called a ceremony, not the white buffalo calf woman ceremony, obviously, that had been missed and would have to wait until next year, but a different ceremony, one specifically for Eagle Feather. They built a proper fire, in daylight, in the open. They burned sage and sweetgrass, and then the eldest medicine man, a man named He Who Walks with Thunder, spoke to Eagle Feather in front of the gathered people. "You think you broke sacred law?" the old man said. "You're right. You did. The question is not whether you broke it. The question is whether you were right to break it." This was not what Eagle Feather expected to hear. In his understanding, sacred law was sacred. You didn't break it and then claim righteousness. He Who Walks with Thunder continued, "The ceremonies exist to serve the people, not the other way around. When ceremony and survival come into conflict, survival must win, because without the people, who performs the ceremonies? The spirits gave us the sacred laws to preserve life, to honor life. You honored life. You preserved the people. You chose the spirit of the law over the letter of the law." He placed his hand on Eagle Feather's shoulder. "The spirits are not angry with you, young man. We have spoken with them. They understand. They guided your hand when you struck that flint. Every firekeeper who lit a forbidden flame that night acted as an instrument of the spirit's will to preserve life." Eagle Feather wept. In front of everyone, this 19-year-old warrior who'd faced an impossible choice and made it, who'd carried the weight of that choice alone for weeks, finally broke down and wept. And the people, instead of seeing weakness, saw exactly what it was. A young man who cared so deeply about doing right that the possibility of having done wrong had nearly destroyed him. Meanwhile, Connor was retreating. His supplies were running low. His horses were exhausted. He'd lost 37 men to ambushes and accidents, and he had absolutely nothing to show for it except abandoned cookpots and worn teepee poles that his soldiers had burned in frustration. $2 million, 2,500 soldiers, 3 months of planning, and he'd been beaten by a network of signal fires and 800 people who refused to wait around to be massacred. The military would officially call Connor's campaign a success in their reports, because admitting failure wasn't popular in Washington. But every soldier who marched in that campaign knew the truth. They'd been outsmarted by people who were supposed to be primitive. They'd been outfought by warriors who were supposed to be no match for modern military tactics. And they'd learned a lesson that many armies throughout history have had to learn the hard way. Knowing the land beats, having the maps every single time. Eagle Feather lived another 47 years after that August night in 1865. Long enough to see his choice transform from a violation into a teaching story. Long enough to become exactly what his grandfather had been, an elder whose words carried weight, whose life became a lesson. But the transformation wasn't immediate. For the first few years after the signal fire incident, Eagle Feather remained uncertain about his place in Lakota spiritual life. He participated in ceremonies, but always with a sense that he was marked, that his violation carried permanent consequences. The spiritual leader's forgiveness had helped, but he hadn't quite forgiven himself. What changed him was teaching. In 1867, when he was 21, a group of young men asked him to train them as firekeepers. The signal system had proven its worth, and it needed to be maintained, needed new keepers to replace those who'd aged out or died. Eagle Feather initially refused. "Find someone else," he told them, "someone who hasn't broken sacred law." One of the young men, barely 16, looked at him with complete confusion. "You broke sacred law to save 800 lives," the boy said. "That's not a mark against you. That's exactly why we want you to teach us, because you understand that the system isn't about rigid rules, it's about wisdom." That conversation, by Eagle Feather's own account later in life, changed everything. He began to understand that his action hadn't diminished his spiritual authority. It had actually enhanced it, because he demonstrated something more important than perfect adherence to law. He demonstrated the courage to make hard choices when circumstances demanded it. He became the primary teacher of the signal system. But his lessons went beyond the technical details of fire placement and relay timing. He taught the young keepers about judgment, about when rules serve life and when life requires breaking rules. "The ceremonies are sacred," he would tell them, "but they are sacred because they preserve the people. If preserving the ceremonies means destroying the people, you've lost the whole point." This wasn't relativism. This wasn't saying all rules are meaningless. This was sophisticated moral reasoning from a culture that understood the difference between rigid legalism and principled flexibility. The Lakota had their laws, their customs, their sacred obligations. Eagle Feather wasn't teaching them to abandon those. He was teaching them to understand the spirit behind the letter. The signal system proved its value again during Red Cloud's War, the conflict that erupted in 1866 over the Bozeman Trail. This was the war that produced the Fetterman Fight, where 81 soldiers under Captain William Fetterman died in an ambush, after famously boasting that with 80 men he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation. The irony is bitter. He got his 80 men, plus one civilian, and none of them survived. What's less known is that the signal fire system provided crucial intelligence before that battle. Firekeepers tracked troop movements out of Fort Phil Kearny for weeks. They knew Fetterman's patterns, knew he was aggressive and overconfident, knew he'd chase a decoy force if one presented itself. The information flowed through the fire network to the war leaders, who planned accordingly. The battle that followed was one of the most complete tactical victories Native Americans ever achieved against the United States Army, and it happened in part because of a warning system that had been refined after that forbidden fire in 1865. Eagle Feather fought in that battle. He was 20 years old, fully integrated back into warrior society, carrying none of the doubt that had plagued him in earlier years. He survived without serious injury, which in a battle that killed 81 men was either remarkable luck or spiritual protection, depending on your perspective. Probably both. The signal system remained active through the 1870s, as the wars on the plains intensified. It saved lives in smaller engagements, warned of cavalry patrols, helped coordinate movements during the hunting season. But it had limitations, and those limitations became tragically apparent at Wounded Knee Creek on December 29, 1890. 300 Lakota, mostly women and children, were camped at Wounded Knee under military guard. They'd already surrendered. They were already surrounded. And when the shooting started, no signal fire could save them. The system that had preserved 800 lives at Tongue River was useless against troops that were already in position, against a situation where there was nowhere to flee. 250 to 300 Lakota died at Wounded Knee. The numbers vary because in the Lakotas, the chaos, with bodies scattered across snow-covered ground and wounded people crawling away to die in ravines, exact counts became impossible. What's certain is that it was a massacre, not a battle, and Eagle Feather, 44 years old by then, had to reckon with the fact that his system, his legacy, his forbidden fire that had saved so many, couldn't prevent this. He fell into depression after Wounded Knee. Not the spiritual crisis of his youth, but something heavier. The despair of a man who'd believed that intelligence and warning could protect his people, confronting the reality that sometimes force was simply overwhelming. Sometimes the system failed not because it was poorly designed, but because the circumstances exceeded its capacity. His grandchildren, who were young adults by then, pulled him out of that depression. They reminded him of what he'd taught them, that you judge a tool by what it can do, not by what it can't. The signal fires had saved 800 lives in 1865. They'd contributed to victory at Fetterman. They'd warned countless hunting parties and small camps over 25 years. The fact that they couldn't prevent Wounded Knee didn't erase those successes. It just defined their limits. Eagle Feather spent his final years as a keeper of stories. The reservations had been established by then. The buffalo were gone. The old way of life was fundamentally broken, but stories remained. And Eagle Feather told his story to anyone who would listen, not as a tale of personal heroism, but as a teaching about adaptation and wisdom. We had sacred laws, he would say, sitting by fires in the cold Montana winters of the early 1900s. Those laws were given to us for good reasons, but the world changed. New threats appeared, and we had to decide, do we preserve the laws perfectly and die, or do we adapt the laws and live? He always made clear that adaptation wasn't abandonment. I didn't light that fire because I thought the ceremonies were meaningless, he explained. I lit it because I understood that the deepest purpose of our ceremonies is to preserve life. I served the spirit by breaking the letter, and the spirits understood. Eagle Feather died in 1912. He was 67 years old, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried his story forward. He'd lived to see the buffalo disappear, the reservations established, the old ways fade into memory and ceremony. But he'd also lived to see his choice validated, his teaching spread, his legacy secured. Today, on August 28th, some Lakota communities light memorial fires, not signal fires, because they're not needed for that purpose anymore, but memory fires, teaching fires, fires that say, this is the night when one young man chose life over law, when 800 people were saved because someone had the courage to do the wrong thing for the right reason. The story of Eagle Feather's forbidden fire has become a teaching tool in contemporary Lakota communities about a question that every culture faces. When do you preserve tradition exactly as you received it, and when do you adapt tradition to serve its original purpose under new circumstances? It's not an easy question. Eagle Feather didn't find it easy in 1865, and we don't find it easy now. But his story suggests an answer. When the choice is between rigid preservation of tradition and the survival of the people who carry that tradition, choose the people. Not casually, not without prayer and consideration, not without understanding the weight of what you're doing, but choose the people, because without them, the traditions die anyway. Eagle Feather lit a forbidden fire and saved 800 lives. That fire burned for one night in 1865. But the light from that flame, the lesson it taught, that still burns today. Every time someone faces an impossible choice between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, every time someone has to decide whether tradition serves life or life serves tradition, every time courage means breaking the rules for the right reasons, that's when we remember a 19-year-old Lakota firekeeper, trembling on a hilltop, asking the spirits for forgiveness, and striking flint to steel in direct violation of sacred law. And we remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is trust your wisdom over your certainty, trust your compassion over your compliance, and light the forbidden fire.